Thanks everybody for joining us today, and a big thanks to Claudia Schabel for making time to talk to us this afternoon. This is the final installment of our Seize the City program, which is a program that I run at the Greater Des Moines Partnership with a focus on programming for young professionals, but we've invited a lot of people to be part of this conversation today because the social justice conversation is important and relevant. So we're excited to have everybody here. My name is Sydney Peasley. I'm with the Greater Des Moines Partnership. I'll kick it off to Claudia while she's presenting. If anybody has any questions for her, feel free to put those in the chat and we'll make sure that she has time to answer those once we get towards the end of the hour. So Claudia, take it away.
Thank you so much, Sydney, for the invitation to have this conversation today with your interns, and I see some familiar faces as well. I am thrilled, although I wasn't expecting the other individuals. So some of you will see a little bit of a repeat from some of the sessions I have done in the past, and I try to keep in mind really the interns that are going to find positions within our organizations in this region. So let me just also preface by saying that I would like this to be a dialogue versus a presentation, even though I have this bad habit of inundating you with videos and slides. I still want you to feel free to interrupt me, to raise your hand, and really turn the conversation where you want this conversation to go, because this is truly your time. So I am here to serve. I have been a part of this community for 21 years. I am originally from Brazil. I have been working as a volunteer in some capacity or another with the Greater Des Moines Partnership for the last 15 years. And my contributions have always been in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it's really an extension of what I do as a person, but also as a business. My business is a consulting firm around diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. So let's have a conversation today about the question, is there room for social justice and equity in the boardroom? And I think that some of you may already have a short answer, yes or no. So if you want to enter your answer in the chat, that will be much appreciated. Just simple, yes or no, yes or no. We're not going to have any poll questions, by the way, for those of you that don't like poll questions. But I would love to hear from you, yes or no. Great, thank you. I'm going to share my screen now. Give me 1 second. And Cindy, if you don't mind, I would love for you to read what you see in the chat room. Is it yes or mostly no? What are you seeing?
We have overwhelmingly yes answers.
Oh, very good. Then we're done. We're done. Conversation's over. So let's start with what's happening in our communities. But I just want to take a few steps back and remind ourselves of what was happening before the very recent protests around George Floyd's death or murder and police brutality. Before we had this protest, there were a lot of people taking their concerns to the streets and taking their values to the streets. And there is a very overwhelming representation of young people on both sides of the issue. And one of the things that I don't think we talk very openly about is that young people today are very well aware of where the issues are. I can't answer for them on how they feel about it, but when we look at pictures like this, it gives us the impression that we have an equal split of representation, which is not the case. I think there are, majorly, you can see that there are a lot of more people wanting to have this conversation about social justice. And that's why we're having a conversation about social justice specifically today, and then moving on to equity. These are some of the recent protests, right? We see a lot of people that are trying to become a part of this conversation. And one thing that we have seen here in Des Moines, and we're continuing to talk about, is how people have reacted to the protests. I will be very transparent with you. During one of the protests that it was being broadcasted via, I think, one of the TV channels that we have here on Facebook, I learned so much about how people feel about the protests just by reading the comments. There are thousands of people watching the broadcast on Facebook live, and all of the comments were coming in, from questioning why are people doing, to you don't have a job so it must be easy to be there, to I don't understand why you're protesting. So right now in our community, we know the protests are happening, but there are still a lot of people that don't support the protests. So as we start thinking about the future of our communities, I think it's important to make room for conversations like the one today, so we can understand, one, where we individually fit in this conversation and what contributions can we make. So I've been using this assessment quite a bit lately, just because I think this is a personal growth, but also professional growth for many of us. So I want for you to take a few seconds, take maybe about 2 minutes, take a look at this chart and find yourself in here. Are you in the fear zone, learning zone, or growth zone? Where are you at when it comes to having conversations about racism? And I'll give you about 2 minutes, and then we'll move on. This is a personal, you don't have to share with anybody where you're at. It's just for you. One more minute. Okay, you may or may not have found yourself in here, and that's okay, but I think that's where we start this work. It's with self-reflection, it's with that inward look about understanding where do we fit, and if we don't know, how do we figure it out? What I have been seeing lately is this urgency to address the issue externally and outwardly. It's really this urgency to demonstrate that individuals and companies, are good people. And I understand that maybe customers, employees are demanding those answers, and that they're demanding that you let them know where you stand. But you also have to be very thoughtful about this process of finding yourself, so your actions are going to match what you're telling them, and it's a sustainable effort, because this is the long haul. This is a conversation for the rest of our lives. This is not going away anytime soon. So let me give you some perspective on what we're really talking about here. When we're talking about social justice, we're talking about how to address those dynamics that impact us personally, that impacts our organizations, and that impacts everything else within the systems that dictate what we do in our daily lives, right? So the interpersonal racism is when we have those differences with individuals that look maybe different from us. Those are instances that we react and we act upon our biases. Institutional racism are those policies that drive inequity within organizations. You may or may not know that they exist. That's why it's very valuable to do an audit of your policies. And then the structural racism, which is really the structure of how our banking is done, how our curriculum is built, how we do things today, from voting, from proposing and passing policy, to the execution of all those things. And just a reminder here that this structure started a long time ago. This is a country that is built on a very strong foundation and a lot of pride for its foundation. So it's very, very common to find that there are things that we have been doing for centuries now that might not be serving us very well. So just understanding that and how that really becomes the backdrop of all of the conversations we're having today might be very helpful. So this is in a nutshell what is happening to all of us, right? We have the structural racism in how we live our lives today, and that impacts almost all communities, if not to say all, and not only in the US, but also outside of the US. So this is truly a global conversation. Then how those history, policies, and practices drive inequitable outcomes and those disparities that we see today. And therefore, we have those associations that continue that vicious cycle over and over and over again. So we have narratives about race that continue to make us think that some races are inferior to white people, inferior to, and fill in the blank. And some of those assumptions really don't allow us to revisit the structure that we have in place today. We have seen the results of that structural racism at play here in Iowa. We have seen positive cases by race. It's a fact that the Latinx and Black communities have been impacted the most. This is not today's data, but it's pretty current data. And most of us might be wondering, why is that? And maybe might be filling the blank with some of our own assumptions. Or maybe they don't do social distancing. Maybe they don't follow the rules. We can make those assumptions and they might be right, but also we should be questioning how come their health is so fragile compared to other groups. How come they have more exposure? What is happening? So we can really get to the root cause problems that are continuing to be discussed today, not only in Iowa, but beyond Iowa. But the COVID-19 positive cases in Iowa are a tremendous opportunity for us to learn about what's happening here. So I encourage you, specifically for those of you that already have some familiarity with the health system, so our public health and so forth, this I think would be a great case study. And then talking about privilege, I had a conversation, open dialogue, and I see that some of my friends are here from that conversation. So I'd love for them to chime in as we continue this conversation about privilege. And when we talk about privilege, given our social identities, each one of us have experienced privilege and marginalization to a certain extent. But when we talk about privilege, often we're talking about white privilege. And that white privilege is not because you are who you are necessarily, because it goes beyond an individual. It's really that association with a group, with that social identity. So it's really important that for people in Iowa and for the interns to look at life in a way that allows you to bring different perspectives. Because what happens is that most of us look at life through our own lens, And we fail to recognize that our experiences are not universal. And not only the result of our hard work, but also the result of our privileged status as well. So what we're talking about here is that for interns, you know, if you are a person of color, maybe there was a question, do I leave my name on the resume? Do I share the information about the organizations that I am involved with at school? Will that give too much away about what my social identities are if I am a person of color? If I am an openly gay student, if I share that I am committed to that cause at school, will that share with my employer that I am gay? All of those questions are common scenarios for many people in our community. But if you don't have those lands, if you don't have those experiences, it's very easy to think that no one has to worry about it. But this is a true conversation, a true question. So there is this person called Peggy McIntosh that did tremendous work in exploring more about what white privilege is. And I'll just summarize here saying that white privilege, in her view, is like an invisible knapsack with special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, you name it. And all those things that you have in your knapsack, you don't even know they're there, but you're walking through the world without having to worry about certain things that other people might have to worry about because they don't have the same knapsack you have. And this is very important to understand because it goes back to that universal view of how things are working in the world. So the structural racism that pretty much determines how we do business, how we apply for jobs, how we decide what companies we're going to work for, all of that influences also our unconscious mind, and it leads to unconscious biases. As you saw, it was part of that vicious cycle. I want to very quickly identify or define for you what unconscious bias really is. Unconscious bias are those quick associations and judgments that we make in our minds outside of awareness, and they happen very, very quickly. And the brain is such a tremendous machine that when we don't know information and we have blank spaces in our brain, we make them up. We're very ingenious that way. And I think that's in one aspect, that's what we want. We want to think for ourselves. But if your assumptions are leading to discriminatory actions, that is a problem. So how do we ensure that our values and our intentions are matching our actions, behaviors, and the outcomes we want to see? So I want you to look at this picture, and this is a poor quality picture, okay? And it says, I will read it to you. It's a grooming product on the right side by Nivea. Nivea is a global company. When I was growing up in Brazil, I remember being an avid consumer of their products. This is specifically for men. And it says, look like you give a damn. And it says Nivea. I can't read whatever is down there. But right in the middle of the picture, it says, recivilize yourself. And we have this man holding this head with an afro and a beard. I want you to put your reactions in the chat. What do you see? And Sydney, if you don't mind reading them out loud, that would be great. Thank you. And by the way, I don't need you to tell me what you see necessarily. I need your interpretation of what you see. What's your interpretation? And if you want to speak up and use your microphone, I welcome that as well.
All right, we've got clean cut is civilized, not natural. To look like a black man makes you look savage. Black men's natural hair is uncivilized. This ad portrays typical African American features as unclean.
Mm-hmm. Anything else? Anyone else? No? Very good. Thank you. That's tremendous. Thank you for sharing. For those of you that shared, this is an ad that I always bring into the classroom with me when I'm talking about unconscious bias for two reasons. One, everything we see is through our own lens, through our what I call our hard drive, which is our subconscious mind. So we have had experiences in our lives that are really shaping how we're looking at things around us and navigating the world. So for some of us, we might look at this picture and don't see anything wrong with it. We just see a clean-shaven person, and that's an ad, and that's it. But for many of us, when we look at this picture, it's very offensive. In fact, this picture in this ad was deemed one of the most racist ads in recent history. And I think it was done in 2016. So this is a real ad. It's poor picture, poor quality because it was pulled out of circulation. And this was the only picture I could find. But second reason is, I don't think that any company will wake up in the morning and say, today we're going to offend our customer base. Today we're going to act as racist as much as we can. We're going to be racist. I don't think anyone consciously decides to do that. To me, this is a completely missed opportunity to, one, understand that this could be misinterpreted. Two, to utilize the talent in the room for feedback. Now, I can always tell you, I don't know if they had Black people in the room to be asked, but if they didn't, they should have. And there are other ways of also collecting feedback. So that's one lesson for all organizations, my organization included. We need to understand what voices are in the room and what voices are not. We can't just base our decision-making on things that we think we know well. Well, this is offensive for many different reasons for some people, but for me, the word recivilize yourself, or the word recivilize alone is offensive. This is a word that if you look at historical context here in the US, it was used to undermine and really not only undermine, but also subjugate African Americans and Black people. And I think this is important to know in the context of what you're trying to do when talking and targeting an African American Black community. I think for the person who commented that, those natural hair and natural features of African Americans could be perceived as uncivilized, and that a lot of people interpret that message to be just that. So again, we might have different interpretations of what this ad is trying to do, but the bottom line is enough people got offended to make a case that this should have not been published. And that was the case that Nivea understood the misstep and pulled the ad, and of course they apologized. And these are missteps that happen to many different companies and could happen to any company. So as an intern, as you're going to those companies, what contribution can you make? What can you do to ensure that you have different lens on, to ensure that processes like this are helping your employer understand the opportunities, but also the pitfalls of certain marketing materials or some conversations that could offend your customers? This is a question. I'm not going to have you do this activity, but I want you to think and I want you to reflect. What are the possible ways that unconscious bias could impact our communities, organizations, and ourselves? So I want you to reflect on this question, because the answer to this question is how you can add value to the conversation around equity in the boardroom. This is how you can impact change, or at least help organizations pay attention to what's happening within their walls. We know, oh, excuse me. We know that younger generations are much more eager and interested in having this conversation. And I will tell you, being a professional in human resources and working for corporations for over a decade, there is such a power in hearing from our young employees and hearing what your concerns are and hearing about how you want to help the organization. So your voice is a tremendous contribution for this conversation, but also for the organizations that you're going to be working for. So don't hesitate to find a way to hold these conversations. You might need to, of course, get your feet wet, get to know a few people, understand who you talk to, but don't let you shy away from this conversation, from having the conversation. Let me show you a video, and I wasn't able to show this video this morning, so I hope I can show it today, right now. This is a very tangible example of how someone can use their privilege to help someone else and also open up conversation about what's not working. So let me try, and Sydney, let me know if the video is playing correctly or not. If there's an issue, just let me know. Oops. Give me a second here.
My sister-in-law, who's half black, half white, but looks white, blue eyes, whiter than most white folks, very white. She and I, we kind of grew up together. We raised our children together. So they're first cousins, and it's the wonderful, very, very multicultural family. So we're going in a Safeway one day. And Kathleen, my sister-in-law, is in front of me, and she's, writing a check for her groceries. Now, my daughter, who at the time was 10 years old, was standing with me, and I was directly behind her, getting ready to get my groceries. So Kathleen comes up, and the checker, who is a strawberry blonde, freckled, very delightful, warm, the checker, this young woman, is talking to Kathleen. Hey, how you doing? This is a nice day today. They're just chatting up, and says, yeah. So Kathy writes her check, and she steps off to the side with her groceries because she's waiting for me. Of course, again, Kathleen looks white, right? So I come up. No conversation. She looks up at me. Absolutely no, just little chatter. And I write my check. My daughter, however, is 10, notices immediately the difference in how she responds to me. So I write my check, and she goes, I'm going to need 2 pieces of ID. At which point my daughter looks at me, and she gets very, very embarrassed, and tears are kind of coming up in her eye, like, Mommy, you're not gonna let her do this. Why is she doing this to us, right? So I'm trying to figure out what I should do, because behind me are 2 elderly white women, right? And I'm thinking, okay, so then I become the angry black woman, right? And they're gonna be, and I'm just trying to second guess all the drama. So then I just give her the 2 pieces of ID. I said, some things you gotta choose your battles, right? And then it gets worse. She pulls out the bad check book, right? So this is the book that shows the people who've written bad checks. So she starts searching for my license in the bad checks, at which point it's just out of control now. Just as I'm standing there trying to decide what to do, and it's really deeply humiliating. Now my daughter is in full-blown emotionally upset, who's 10. My sister-in-law walks back over. And she steps in and she says, excuse me, why are you doing this? And the checker goes, well, what do you mean? She goes, why are you taking her through all of these changes? Why are you doing that? She goes, well, this is our policy. She goes, no, it's not your policy because you didn't do that with me. Oh, well, I know you've been, she goes, no, she's been here for years. I've only lived here for 3 months. And so at this point, the 2 white elderly ladies go, oh, I can't believe what this checker has done with this woman. It is totally unacceptable. At which point the manager walks over. So the manager walks over and says, is there a problem here? And then my sister-in-law again responds. She goes, yes, there is a problem here. Here is what happened. So you see, she used her white privilege. And even though Kathleen is half black and half white, she recognizes what that means. And she made the statement. She pointed out the injustice. And she, as a result of that one act, influenced everyone in that space. But what would have happened? I can't know for certain, had the Black woman said, this is unfair, why are you doing this to me? Would it have had the same impact? But Kathleen knew that she walked through the world differently than I did. And she used her white privilege to educate and make right a situation that was wrong. That's what you can do every single day.
So how often do you think this happens? Put your answer in the chat room. Now, let me just clarify. The question here is not about the rules and the procedures. If there are rules and there are procedures and they apply to everyone, I think most of us are okay with that. But if someone is just deciding when to apply those procedures depending on how they feel about a person right in front of them, and maybe race or any other identity might influence them, then that's where the unfairness come into play. And that's what we're talking about here today. What did you hear, Sydney? What are people saying?
We've got quite often, more often than it should, too often, more often than people imagine.
Yes. Okay. Very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I want you to walk away with some ideas and considerations. So I'm going to start with the obvious. Embrace identity that people around you bring to the table. It's a very important step to take as to become an anti-racist activist. So what I mean by that is that we're still having conversations in Iowa about not seeing color. We're still having conversations in Iowa about not seeing differences. And I think it has everything to do with the culture in Iowa, in which is to be kind, make friends, and get along and get the work done. I think that has everything to do with the culture of Iowa. With that said, we need to strive for balance there, because by acknowledging differences, it does not mean that we're going to start a war or we're going to start a conflict. No, it means if Sydney looks the way she looks the way she looks. And that it shouldn't impact how her opinions have contributed to this conversation, or if I think less or more of her. And I think that's what we need to acknowledge, because the conversation won't change until we acknowledge that we see those differences. This is a big step for Iowa, and I'm hoping that all of us can help the state move forward. So seeing color, it doesn't mean walking around and pointing people out, but it means to acknowledge that when you are interacting with someone from a different background, that also influences the interaction and the conversation you're having, because your experiences might be very different. So our differences make us unique, and that's what adds value to our employers. When we are hired, we are hired because we have a gift, we have skills, and our experiences that just elevate those skills. So how do we make a contribution? We talked a little bit about biases. They're conscious or unconscious, and these biases are not going to go away. But that said, it is still our responsibility to understand the impact of those biases on how we interact with people, how we make decisions, and how we do our work. So from an individual perspective, what accountability are you willing to take, and how committed are you in finding ways to interrupt those biases so your intentions are matched with the impact that you really want to see? No one is immune to biases. Often now, because of what's happening, given George Floyd's murder, we're talking about race. There's a lot of intersectionality between all of us. I am an immigrant, Latinx woman. Just right there, it's a lot to unpack. So we always bring those different dimensions of who we are to the table with us. So even though right now we are talking about race, no matter who you are, no one is immune to those biases. I would bet that you have experienced some type of bias in your life. So be aware that all of us are going to have to mitigate that on the giving end, but also on the receiving end. And how do we do that? How do we do it with grace? How do we do it with empathy, but also with determination to move the conversation forward? So systemic and structural changes need to happen. They're much needed now more than ever. And what actions can you take to lead the change? Now, as an intern, I think many of us might be thinking, oh my gosh, Claudia, I'm not the CEO, I'm an intern. There's so much I can do. Yes and no. I just yesterday had a conversation with an intern that is working on a wonderful project. She's looking at helping her company with increasing representation of Latinx talent. And now she is engaged in this project, and she just reached out to me and we had a wonderful conversation. And she's going to make some recommendations for them based not only on our conversation, but on what she has been finding out. So interns have a tremendous opportunity to help educate organizations about what's happening and how important it is for organizations to take more action when it comes to serving their customers. Educate yourself. We have this wonderful exhibit. I know that you have perhaps participated in the virtual tour of the Undesign the Red Line exhibition. This is tremendous. This is just one little piece of all the other things that you and I need to learn. The more you learn, more equipped you become in having conversations like the conversations we're having today. Use your privilege, just like that video. Use your privilege to influence those micro actions, those small interactions that we have with people on a daily basis, but also those systemic changes that I just talked about. How do you speak up on behalf of others? Now, it's often shared that if you are not feeling the brunt and the weight of an unfair practice, an unfair policy, often we go silent. Often we don't say anything because we haven't experienced firsthand. And what I'm encouraging you to do here is, even if you don't feel the brunt or the weight of a policy or of something that seems on the surface a little questionable, I want you to stop. I want you to pause. I want you to ask, I wonder what type of impact this is making on this individual, on this group of people. Just a question like that will position you to engage in a conversation to find out, is this practice unfair? Is it inequitable? Should something change? Number 2 here, become a AAA. A AAA is an ally, an accomplice, and an advocate. An ally is something that starts with having conversations and learning more about these topics, more the issues, more about the struggle in general. An accomplice is when you're willing to be a part of the solution. You're willing to help someone do something about the issues. And an advocate is when you are doing it on your own and you're advocating on behalf of everybody. And again, let me just differentiate. An advocate is not a savior, because no one needs a savior. And to be honest, we don't like saviors. But what we do like is an advocate that is not speaking for me, but it's lifting up my voice. It's lifting up issues that are impacting me and are helping move that conversation forward in order to see the change that we want to see. Let me show you a video, and this will be the last one, about a video that was put together by Netflix about what it means to be an ally, just for those of you that need something a bit more tangible. So here we go.
Hello.
What's going down?
Oi.
Hi.
Marhaba, أنا نو.
Konnichiwa.
Vamos a hablar.
This is about you.
This is about us.
I'm a father of 4 amazing kids. A dancer, but only in my bedroom.
A believer in the power of stories. Soy bilingüe, casi trilingüe.
An engineer. A nerd.
Soy lésbica. Yo soy amiga.
Japanese. Korean.
Palestinian, a German national. An immigrant, East Asian American woman of color. And a Zamiltek.
あなたも私の同僚です. We make amazing things together. We aspire to bring joy
To the entire world.
But
You and I inhabit different worlds.
you and I have access to different spaces. Unless you've experienced it, you can never fully understand what it's like to be stuck between 2 cultures.
To pretend to be someone else in order to be safe.
To grow up in South America in Spanish, and at 19 having to relocate to the US and live in English.
To be a Black gay man from the rural South and be the only one in the room.
Unless you've experienced it yourself, you can never really know what it's like.
To have to listen to someone be degrading to your race and be the only person of that race in the room.
To lose friends, family, co-workers, simply because you wanted to be who you are.
To not know whether you can call the country that you love home.
To be the father of a trans daughter.
I think we all have a responsibility to make the world that we live in a little bit better. And you kind of have to start where you are.
What allyship is listening, compassion.
To immerse yourself in content, in experiences and stories from groups that aren't of your own.
Anybody who sees something that isn't quite right can become an ally and help their colleagues.
When you've been through a struggle that hurt you for such a long time, I think you have this endless energy to give to others.
Anyone can be an ally, and everyone can use an ally, and you can use your privilege in the moment to extend that privilege to someone else.
I think this is what makes us human, to help others and to be empathetic.
We're all learning.
We're all learning. Está todo mundo aprendendo.
Mabad.
Together
Juntos.
is one company.
We can all be allies.
We can all be allies.
So I want now for you to take a look at the assessment again. And of course, in 30 some minutes, we wouldn't have moved very far. But I want you to find yourself in this chart again and see if there is one piece of it that now perhaps you're more open to talking about or understanding. Okay, I want to make one more remark here, and then I'd love to have questions from the group, and I'll stop sharing my screen so I can see all of you. But many of you might accept positions with companies that have established efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And often this is where this conversation resides, but it's not exclusive to diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. So this conversation can be a part of any team meeting. It can be a part of a conversation about how to do certain things within your department. So even if you're not a part of those formal efforts, don't shy away from tapping into some of the skills and curiosity you have on how to advance change. For those of you that find employment or accept employment with companies that don't have established diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, you could be the catalyst for formalizing around this conversation that you want to have. So don't underestimate your power in starting the conversation. And sometimes that's what companies are waiting for. And again, I'm not telling you how to do it. I'm telling you that there are opportunities. Just this week, I had a presentation with a group of HR professionals around the power of employee resource groups. And now more than ever, employee resource groups are being utilized to not only host conversations like the conversation we're having today, but also to help the organization find that new direction if they need to pivot. So I would love to hear questions. Do we have time for questions, Sydney?
We absolutely do. So if anybody has any, feel free to either unmute yourself and ask those or drop those in the chat, and then we can get them answered that way. And I actually have one for you that somebody sent earlier. For our students and our interns that are on the call that are looking at starting to interview for full-time positions post-grad, do you have recommendations of questions that they can ask during the interview process to kind of find out where those companies are at in this conversation?
Yes, thank you so much. I think that's a perfect question. So yes, I think first of all, it starts just on the job post, right? When you see the position posted, and if you don't see anything about their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, that should be a question from the start. When, let's say you're having a conversation over the phone, often that conversation over the phone is just what HR professionals might call a screening interview, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't be asking that question right there and then. But let's say then you progress into the process and then you have a face-to-face interview, which now might be more of a Zoom interview. Do ask, do you have a diversity and inclusion statement? Do you have formalized diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts? Do you have a strategy? How can an individual become a part of those efforts? So I think it's important to just those questions right there will open up a conversation about where they're at in this process. And if the company is telling you no and not trying to tell you that they're having that conversation, I think it's a pretty good sign that they're not ready to, or might not be able to share with you, but perhaps they're not ready to engage in that conversation. When I consult with my clients, one of the first things I tell them is that this conversation is constant. When you are interviewing employees, you have to let them know where you're at in the process, what you're willing to do, how that work is going, because that will help them determine if they want to be a part of your company. That is how you hire for diversity. It's that mindset. Often when we talk about hiring for diversity, we only stick with the gender, we stick with the race. But hiring for diversity means you want that mindset. So you want them to know your organization is all about embracing inclusivity for all. And if they're on board with that, they're welcome. Next question, Sydney.
Yep, I've got another one for you. If a board has always been made up of wealthy white people, how do you take action and bring other people of color into the board?
The board, yeah. Board recruitment is a separate conversation, but a very important one. I am working with a client right now, and they're trying to diversify their credit union board. And it's a process. I'm not going to lie. It's a process. You have to be thoughtful, and you have to reevaluate the process you have in place right now and understand where some potential gaps might be. So I'm not sure I want to go into the weeds with that, but you need a process, and you need to understand if that process is working to attain your goals.
For those that are working in companies that don't have established D&I policies or practices, do you have recommendations of very tangible, practical first steps And are those different now that we're conducting most of our business virtually?
Yes. Yes. So I think it always starts with a conversation with your leader. Your leader is going to be your champion. So start the conversation with your leader and ask, are there formalized, established efforts, and how can I be a part of it? And if that leader has the responsibility to not only help you understand the company, but also to leverage your skills and your gifts for the benefit of the whole company. So that leader, I see them as an ally. So I hope you can build a relationship with your leader. And that leader, if they're telling you, you know what, Sydney, we can't influence the whole organization right now, but I want you to help our team, then that's where you start. You start with your team. And often when you start with your team and other teams start seeing what you're doing, they want some of that too. And that's how things usually spread.
Okay, if we don't have any other questions, we're getting close to 1 o'clock, so we want to keep everybody on time. Thank you so much, Claudia, for being willing to share today. Great information. You mentioned a couple of times the Undesign the Red Line tour, and we had a comment in the chat about how valuable that has been. I dropped a link in there. I cannot recommend enough that everybody check that out. The Polk County Housing Trust Fund did an excellent job of curating that exhibit, and they do virtual tours. It's excellent.
Yes, very good.
Thank you to everybody else for joining us today. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is our final Seize the City event. Seize the City is a programming opportunity for students and interns in the area. So if you are an intern or work with an intern who's not yet connected, feel free to connect them with me, and we'll get them connected to some of our resources happening for them this summer. So thanks again to Claudia, and thanks to everybody for joining us today.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.